As a disclaimer, this book was written by Carleen Faith, who has since passed away in the year of 2017. This book did not show up in the U.S. copyright search when I looked for it, though of course that does not mean it is not copyrighted. I have no idea who technically owns the copyright. This book is being read to look into the dynamics of prison life that Leslie Van Houten went through as presented up until 2001. If the rightful owner of this book would prefer that I take this down, please contact me and I will provide my email address below. That said, this is The Long Prison Journey of Leslie Van Houten, Life Beyond the Cult by Carleen Faith. Originally published by Northeastern University Press in 2001 by Carleen Faith. This book was dedicated to Jane Van Houten. About the author, Carleen Faith. Carleen was born in 1938 and she passed away in 2017. She earned her Ph.D. at the University of California in Santa Cruz in 1981. As part of her doctoral program, she and others founded the Santa Cruz Women's Prison Project at the California Institute for Women, CIW, in the early 1970s. Dr. Faith met 3 of the Manson girls after the warden asked her to develop courses specifically for them as they were living in isolation from other inmates. This is something that Susan Atkins wrote about in her book, Child of Satan, Child of God. Dr. Faith continued her advocacy work for women in prison during her 20-year academic career in women's studies and criminology at Simon Fraser University. She published more than a dozen books, including, in 1993, Unruly Women, The Politics of Confinement and Resistance, which won the Vanxity Women's Book Prize in 1994. The book was republished by Seven Stories Press in 2011. Dr. Faith was considered one of Canada's leading sociologists on women and prison. She received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Society of Criminology in 2001 and the Dean of Arts Medal from SFU in 2002, among other awards. She retired from SFU as a professor emerita in 2002. Acknowledgements. My first appreciation goes to Leslie's good friends and mine, Sue Talbot and Nancy Stoller. Over many years, their loyalty and vigilance have been reassuring. Special thanks to Nancy for her careful reading of the manuscript at 2 different stages, and her wise suggestions for improvements. As explained in the introduction, Anne Neer played a major role in helping me formulate my thinking about the Manson crimes. Anne's dialogic skills and keen editorial hand have guided my approach to this book 2 decades after our collaboration. I am deeply grateful for Anne's friendship and for her work on this project. I'm also grateful to Holly Neer for her varied assistance and support over many years. Special thanks to Linda Grippy, Leslie's good friend since their high school days, for her valuable, reliable assistance and warm-hearted reassurances throughout the writing of this book. Thanks to friends Deborah Miller, Sue Talbot, Sally Savitz, and Frances Reed for camaraderie and exchanging court-watching notes during Leslie's second trial in 1977. Thanks to journalist Anne Japanga and criminologist Nils Christie for their encouragement long ago to embark on this project. Loving appreciation to Pamela Sleeth for her expert and generous guidance in helping me come to a clearer understanding of cult phenomena. Thanks to lawyer Ellen Barry for her sustained commitment to the human rights of prisoners and their children and for facilitating information gathering. Special thanks to friend and colleague Simon Verdon Jones for giving me a place at Simon Fraser University, where I've worked since 1982, and for his steady support. Special thanks to Jane Van Houten for her wisdom, enduring patience, cheerful disposition, and boundless compassion. I'm grateful to my numerous family members and friends who took the time to learn about Leslie and to support her release. In the course of writing this book, I had the good fortune to be approached by Eileen Malm, an SFU graduate student in criminology. Her offer of assistance resulted in the sorting of over 25 years of letters from Leslie. Eileen also assisted with last-minute research, referencing, and manuscript preparation. My keen thanks to her for her gracious generosity of time, skill, and good humor. My nephew Scott Anderson is a computer whiz. He was indispensable to this project, as he has been in previous work whenever computer questions arose. For additional computer assistance, his partner, Kate Mangan, came to my rescue. Thank you, Scott and Kate. Special appreciation goes to Jean Gallick, who was my partner in organizing the University of California tutorial program in 1972 in the women's prison. She lent her bright spirit and many talents to an uncommon teaching situation. Her companionship and support from the outset made the project possible. Thanks, too, for her evocative comments on an early draft of the manuscript. Others who read all or parts of the manuscript at various stages, or who discussed the project with me, whose critiques or encouragement were immensely helpful, included Beverly Beetham Endersby, Robert Spitzer, Lorraine Goodman, David Estrin, Bonnie Berry, Kath Moody, John Moody, Carolyn Bell, Dorothy Dittrich, Liz Straker, and a number of anonymous reviewers. I am grateful to each of them. It was Bonnie Berry who suggested Northeastern University Press for publication, and who made the initial contact on my behalf with Sarah Rowley, editorial assistant, and Bill Froelich, director and editor-in-chief. Thank you, Bonnie, from my heart, and thank you, Sarah, Bill, and Anne Twombly, production director, for moving swiftly and efficiently through the manuscript preparation process. Sarah Claire Renzetti, the series editor, and Diana Donovan, the copy editor, provided me with excellent suggestions for changes. My thanks to all of you. Any flaws or errors in the work are clearly my own responsibility. Except as noted, all the opinions expressed herein are my own. Finally, I offer everlasting thanks to Leslie Van Houten for all the ways she reveals her deep humanity and respect for life. Those who know the details of her crime only as presented by the media will see this statement as paradoxical, if not perverse, even blasphemous. These contradictions are part of the reason I believe we need to pay attention to her. I am grateful to have known Leslie as a friend since 1972. I have endeavored to do her justice without fanning or dismissing the enduring grief of Lino and Rosemary Lombianca's families. Vancouver, February 2001. A chronology of Leslie. Leslie was born on August 23, 1949. On August 10, 1969, Lino and Rosemary LaBianca were murdered. Leslie, at the time, was 19 years old. In October of 1969, Leslie was arrested in Inyo County on suspicion of theft. She was 20 years old. December of 1969, she was connected to the LaBianca murders and transferred to Sybil Brand Institute, the jail in Los Angeles. From June 1970 through April 1971, Leslie remained at the Sybil Brand Institute through pretrial and trial. April 19, 1971, the 21-year-old Leslie Van Houten was sentenced to death and thereafter transferred to death row at the California Institution for Women to await execution in the San Quentin gas chamber. February 1972, 22-year-old Leslie lived to see the California State Supreme Court abolish the death penalty. Her sentence was converted to life in prison, though in 1976 the death penalty was reinstated. June 1972, U.S. Supreme Court outlawed capital punishment nationally for 4 years. In 1974, Leslie, 24 years old, completely disassociated from Charles Manson. In 1976, at age 26, she was transferred to the main prison at California Institution for Women. Later, in the late 1970s, the lawyer Maxwell Keith succeeded in overturning the original sentence, and Leslie was returned to Silverbrand Institute to await a second trial. Her second trial began, and it later ended up with a deadlocked jury, and she ended up being free on bail. This book later on talks a little bit about this, and Leslie Van Houten spent about 6 months out on bail with Carleen Faith. The third trial then later began, and Leslie was returned to Silverbrand Institute to await sentencing, of which she was convicted on 2 counts of felony robbery murder and returned to California Institution for Women. And as of 2001, the date of this book, Leslie remained in prison. Introduction. This is a book about Leslie Van Houten, who, 3 decades ago, at the time in 2001, gained infamy as one of the Manson girls. She was about 19 years old when she participated in murder. For the sake of continuity with this book, I will repeat what is written, but as of 2025, as I am recording this, we do realize that Leslie has been set out on parole. Keep in mind, when this book was written, Leslie was still in prison and would remain so for almost another 20 years. Well, more than that. Anyway, keep in mind this book was written when Leslie was still in prison. She has been in prison since October 1969, except for 6 months in early 1978 when she was out on bail, before and during her third trial. I met Leslie in 1972 when I was tutoring and doing research at the California Institute for Women. In February 1972, the California State Supreme Court abolished the death penalty, so Leslie's sentence of death was reduced to life in prison. Virginia Carlson, the warden at CIW, wanted to institute programs for these new lifers and asked me to tutor the 3 women who were still being held on death row. Then known as the Manson girls, Leslie Van Houten, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel had been convicted with Charles Manson and Charles Tex Watson, who was convicted separately, for the 1969 murders of 7 strangers in their homes. Charles Manson spent much of his life in reformatories and prisons for common street crimes such as burglary, car theft, forgery, and pimping. In 1967, in his mid-30s, he was free on parole. In 1968, he was the unlikely spiritual guru of a cult, and in 1969, he orchestrated 2 nights of brutal murder, including the highly publicized mass murder at the home of Sharon Tate, where 5 people were killed. Fear gripped the Los Angeles area, as details were reported ad nauseum. The accused, in addition to Manson, were 3 of the many young girls and 1 of the young men who had been living in a commune led by Manson, referred to by the press as the family. Leslie Van Houten was not present at the Tate murders. She did, however, accompany 2 other Manson disciples on the second night of murder. This book does not minimize the horror of what happened to Rosemary and Lino LaBianca in the wee hours of August 10th, 1969. But my first aim is to clarify the events that led to Leslie's and the others' participation in that tragedy and Manson's effects on them. More personally, I offer a portrait of the Leslie I have known, from the time before Charles Manson lost his power over her to the present. This version of the life of a Manson girl differs from other versions, in that I learned the stories firsthand over decades. During the 30 years following the murders, many changes have occurred in Leslie's life. In the mid-1970s, she completely separated from Manson's power. She then began the hard work of realizing what she'd done and of doing penance. She matured quietly and gracefully through young adulthood and middle age, making life within her prison community. Those who believe she should have been put to death for her crime are understandably angry that she, unlike her victims, has had the opportunity to mature at all, even if it is in the harsh conditions of prison. I argued that, unless punishment is meant to be limitless, It is time for her to be paroled. Most of what is known about Leslie by those over age 50 in the year 2000 is what they saw sensationalized in the press or on TV at the time of the crime and the first trial, and from a mass market book written a few years later by Vincent Bugliosi, the prosecutor of 4 of the 5 Manson defendants. This age group might remember stories about a trio of girls who jeered at the judge. Girls who, on the command of Manson, like robots, shaved their heads to show solidarity. Most of what is known about Leslie by those who are younger than 50 is simply a vague image of one of the so-called Manson girls who murdered for Charlie, an image based on Manson lore and mythology that has been transmitted from one generation to another, often on the internet. In prisoner education and human rights work over the years since the early 1970s, I've encountered thousands of women and hundreds of men in various U.S. and Canadian prisons. Hundreds of them have struck me as unusually gifted or strong in character. Leslie Van Houten is an especially remarkable person, both because of who she is today and because of how she got that way. I make this assertion while understanding why many readers might protest any affirmation of any kind, for any reason, of anyone involved with Charles Manson. For years, Leslie and I talked about doing a book together. By 1980, I'd been gathering notes for 7 years, and Leslie had ideas on how we might structure her story. Yet I was confounded about how to begin until I began talking with my friend Ann Neer, whose perspective I valued. Her full life has included being a wartime factory worker, a demonstrator at peace marches, a rancher and rancher's wife, a record company co-manager, a mother of 4 and grandmother of 5, a human rights, community, and arts activist, a mentor to many, and an author. And now retired, Anne turned 84 in the year 2000. Anne and I had been transcribing my interviews with women in prison. She rightly questioned the value of working on Leslie's story because Leslie was unlike most other women in the prison. She came from a middle-class background, and her life seemed to have been idyllic until her adolescence. Also, her sensationalized crime was altogether unusual. A woman accused of murdering strangers has been a rare phenomenon in the history of crime. It is not difficult to understand the circumstances of crimes such as theft or drug possession or even domestic murder. But it is difficult to understand how a woman could attempt to murder a stranger. The year before I began teaching and doing research at CIW, I had taught at Soledad State Prison. At Soledad, I felt perfectly at ease with men who had murdered, while believing I was the kind of person who could never kill anyone. But when I first started working at CIW in 1972, I heard stories of situations that could have happened to any woman. Leslie's conviction, however, was for something profoundly out of the ordinary. Though in 1980 I had been acquainted with Leslie, Susan, and Patricia for 8 years, I hadn't talked with them about the crime since 1973. And except for a few of their family members and mutual friends, I rarely spoke with anyone on the outside about them. Because I valued Anne's opinions, and because she was interested in my work with women in prison, we engaged in a series of taped dialogues about crime, women, punishment, and prison life. Anne's questions eventually helped me focus on how to draw meaning from the horrific events that had brought Leslie and the others to prison. Anne's insights were key to my coming to terms with what seemed incomprehensible. We discussed Leslie's crimes and its effects, her trial, her 2 retrials, and her 6-month release on bail. My experience of Leslie in and out of prison, and what we thought the Manson crimes meant, and the context of the world at large. Anne helped clarify my thinking about the Manson girls and the times in which they lived. In the 1960s, teenagers and young adults throughout America and beyond were faced with their powerlessness against possible annihilation from the Cold War and their lack of the right to vote against fighting a war in Vietnam, which was costing more and more lives. In the United States, the voting age was lowered from 21 to 18 in July 1971 as a response to Vietnam veterans who complained about being old enough to kill, but not old enough to vote. Searching for spiritual meaning, many studied Eastern thought as explained in Western terms, with or without a guru, teacher, looking for nirvana, perfect peace. Leslie's spiritual quest and her trust in her guru were not unusual for the time. She joined Manson's cult and she was brainwashed. Manson's followers were led from being independent, promising young people, to being obedient disciples who lost their ability to think for themselves. The conversations with Anne were immensely clarifying to me, but it was many more years before I gained enough distance to proceed with this book. An emerging scholarly literature on cult programming offers support for the view that Leslie and the others in the Manson family were victims of brainwashing by the man they had adopted as their guru. In the years before I talked with Anne, I had seen the so-called Manson girls begin to realize they were no longer members of a special family. In talking with Anne Neer, I came to appreciate how, before they met Manson, these women had been over-socialized to be utterly feminine, at the extreme end of a continuum of male dominance and female compliance. Much has transpired in all our lives since my conversations with Anne in her farmhouse kitchen in Northern California, but the words still ring true. I came to see Leslie, Susan, and Pat as victims of a tortured boy who became a murderous, controlling man. A man with a penchant for seducing and exploiting, trusting, vulnerable young women. A charismatic negative force, he transformed their lives in ways that could not have been anticipated by anyone who knew them. Keeping in touch with Leslie. In one form or another, my contact with Leslie has been fairly steady, beginning in 1972. Since 1982, having returned from California to my native Canada, I have been able to visit Leslie only rarely. Our communication consisted primarily of sporadic correspondence until 1995, when we began speaking on the phone from time to time. Leslie had to stand in a long line to sign up for each call she makes, and then wait with all the others to see if her name will be called. She doesn't always make the list because too many others are ahead of her. Time to make calls is limited. When she does make the list, she has many people to call, including her mother, Jane, and her friend, Linda Grippy, who, since high school, has been like a sister to her. When she does call me, our 12-minute maximum conversations are monitored and taped, and we're frequently interrupted by a recording to remind me, first in English, then in Spanish, that I'm speaking with a California state prisoner, that our conversation is being recorded, and that if I want to cut off the call, I should hang up immediately, and no one at that inmate facility will ever be able to call my number again. Between and through these recorded interruptions, we chat rapidly and uninhibitedly about our lives and whatever big questions either of us has been mulling over since our last chat. Over the years, there were times when I was forbidden to write or to visit anyone in the prison. For example, on one occasion, I wrote a letter to Leslie and enclosed an article I'd authored in which I mentioned the Venceremos Brigade, referring to groups of young people from the States who, despite the U.S. ban on travel to Cuba, went there every year to help with the sugarcane harvest. The problem was that the word Venceremos, a call to overcome obstacles to freedom, was also the name of a political group that had freed a prisoner from Chino, a neighboring male prison, at the expense of a guard's life. So, understandably, the authorities weren't taking any chances when they read that word in my article. Some months later, after more intensive background and security checks than those to which I'd already been subjected, I was able to resume my visits and our correspondence. Writing about Leslie. For 3 decades, the dominant media images of the Manson family have neglected to convey the continued bewilderment of those directly involved in the infamous crimes. As a former Manson disciple, Leslie is troubled by young people who romanticize the mythic Charles Manson. 30 years ago, Leslie's devotion to him exceeded her survival instincts, and so she is in prison. But now she is speaking. She speaks out to demystify a seasoned deceiver who tricked and trapped young people, and to not let her own life be ruled by fear of him. Overcoming fear of any kind is a challenge to anyone in prison. A life sentence can be more frightening than execution. Leslie tries to transform that fear. She says, "I accept that society rejects me, and that this is my world. I don't feel compelled to connect with society. I am a banished person. What I do is educate, when possible, those who cross my path, and help young women find a way. I care about those in my world and try to help them reclaim their lives." My formal research on women and criminal justice has involved participant observation in the prison, court watching, interviewing over 100 women in prison, and gathering data from institutional records and from answered questionnaires, from library searches, and from document analyses. Leslie's story, as I tell it, unfolds from and is illuminated by these sources, but my primary research on Leslie is personal and is based on our communications over many years, in various locations, and from our changing perspectives. For reasons of critical method and of basic integrity, I cannot feign detachment. The day will come when Leslie will be able to tell her own story in her own words. I offer this book as an introduction to Leslie from the perspective of our friendship, buttressed by research. The bulk of this book is not Leslie's story so much as it is the story of my perception, of how she got to where I see her now. This story of Leslie is based on my observations, records, and memory of events at which I was present. Interview transcripts and audio and videotapes. Notes from court and from taped parole hearings, miscellaneous documents, secondary sources, and 25 years of correspondence. I have quoted from the dialogue with Ann Neer, and I have quoted from Leslie's letters and audio and videotaped interviews and conversations within the prison and on the outside during Leslie's 6 months of freedom in 1978 when she was out on bail following a second trial, all with Leslie's permission. As I wrote, I tried to keep Leslie's voice at the center of my mind, no matter who was speaking in text, in order to avoid misrepresenting her. Part 2 consists almost entirely of excerpts from Leslie's letters to me from 1972 and 1978. Leslie is not looking for anyone to serve as her apologist. In her interactions with others, she is humble, never forgetting her part in a crime she remembers all too well. Viscerally, with all her senses, rubbed raw on a regular basis by the repetition of details in legal trials. When Barbara Walters interviewed Leslie for ABC television in January 1977, 7.5 years after the crime, she asked Leslie to explain how she copes with the nightmare of the crime. "Is it something that you think of as having happened to somebody else?" Walters asked. Leslie replied, "No. It's very real to me. It's very real to me at night when I'm alone in my cell with my thoughts, It's at that point that I don't try to block it out. That's part of the hell that I'll have to live with forever.